Hi, I'm Rajnish.
And I'm Brigid.
Welcome to Pterodactyls,
the podcast where reality matters.
It's an honor to have Dr. Dre or Andrea Bogomolni. I've known her for several years. She's a daughter of my friend and colleague, Dr. Roberto Bogomolni. And I've been always impressed with all the work that Andrea has been doing. And I'm so excited to bring Andrea and her work to our Terra Science listeners. So, Andrea, let's start with who you are. How did you get started in what you're doing? So, tell us a little background.
Sure. So I feel like that's a very winding road story. So I'll try and be brief. So I started doing work with marine mammals and ocean conservation 20 years ago, thinking I'd actually just go into environmental education because I love teaching. And I actually thought I would never get into research. That's what, as you said, my father does. He's a researcher. And I actually fell in love with that. So I moved to Woods Hole, Massachusetts about 20 years ago from the West Coast and started doing more ocean science work on toxicology and health of marine mammals, specifically seals, and really fell in love with this idea that we could answer all these questions and try and figure out the health of animals and our ecosystem. So that led me down a path of working for an organization called the Cape Cod Stranding Network, where we rescued whales, dolphins, seals. And my interest was in the necropsies. Actually, why do these animals die? Why do they get sick? And what can we learn about it to help the living? And that opened up another entire world to me about what we could learn. And it really got me thinking about what are the big, factors of what humans are doing. It's not just these small particles or chemical components we're putting in our ocean, but the biggest threat is actually what we do in our oceans in terms of fisheries.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest threat to all marine mammals is actually bycatch in fishing gear. So with all these studies that I was doing, it opened up this other path. So I studied pathology, went back to school, studied pathology to understand more of that component of health, but also was working in communities to do stranding response in the Caribbean, on Cape Cod, working with fishermen, and it sort of got me down this other path. And that path has led me to do cooperative research in the fishing community and also the health and marine mammal communities. So very winding road, I guess, that's led me to really understand what binds us all is really the people.
Well, and a lot of that work is very important, especially in economies that rely on fishing and the environments that can be changed or easily affected by human activity. And you've done a lot of work on seals, by the way. Just I wanted to mention you have a PhD in pathology, animal pathology, and also you had masters, but you are also an artist. So it's a multidisciplinary approach that you bring to this effort. So tell us a little bit about your work with the fishermen and with the issue of the seals, where there was a bounty on the seals for decades.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. Yeah, it's a really interesting history. And again, I get so excited about the people part of the story. I think as a scientist, we're maybe trained not to dive into that as much as like a natural scientist, but the social science and those reasons and behaviors and the perceptions that people have really drive so many of these conservation issues. So in the entirety of the world, there was an era of exploitation here, and especially the East Coast of the United States, where I live on Cape Cod, and it's called Cape Cod for a reason. So fisheries were exploited for a very long time. And in a very short period of time, maybe 100 years, the resources were exploited to the point of just disappearing. And seals were caught in that crossfire of really the scapegoat of trying to explain where the fish all went. It must have been the seals. It wasn't the fishing pressure, right?
I see, yeah.
Yeah, so bounty hunts were placed on seals in Massachusetts and Maine in the 1880s. And that was at the peak point of exploitation. And if for people that may not know, it was also a high period for whale exploitation, not just fish. And at that time, the thought was if we got rid of all the seals, the fish would come back, which of course is a fallacy of, human scapegoating. But because of those bounty hunt, seals were extirpated from this region, from the US. The gray seals were pretty much gone. There were none left. And it was only after protections were put in place 80 years later that the gray seals started to come back again, recolonize from Canada, and the harbor seals were able to return slightly. But the legacy of that is this idea that seals are responsible for the demise of fisheries. And today, that same perception, especially for good reason, we see those animals, they do eat fish. They are blamed for the demise of, or the lack of recovery of a lot of fish species out there.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think what you're doing is really like both beautiful and just so important, because that cannot be an easy job to study that. Like, I imagine you must have to spend a lot of time out there gathering data, or, just in harsh conditions probably, compared to, some jobs where you don't have to deal with the weather conditions as well to just do the work. But that's so important because someone's got to do it, otherwise that perception would just carry on, right?
Yeah, and I think part of it though is not so much, I think the difficulty, and it's really interesting, isn't necessarily the field conditions, it's the ability to talk to one another. And
Gotcha.
Oftentimes with these conflict issues, or we call them like the coexistence issues, which now exist, if we want to solve these problems, these big, huge, complicated, interwoven problems, we have to talk to each other. So I guess the more complicated is having these conversations on a moving boat
There you go.
while you're trying to collect data. And for me, it's actually a joy. So I do field work in the middle of winter with seal pups, which is amazing. But then I also find the most satisfaction of just working with commercial fishermen and trying to understand what their day's like. What do they see? Where does this interaction or perception of what's actually happening come from? So I can truly understand and listen to the whole story. And I'm obviously maybe biased, right? My upbringing has been in conservation, not in realizing that conservation means there's people in that conversation as well, right? So I have to take that bias. That's the hard part.
Do you feel like the conversation, or like, are the fishermen in some cases not very cooperative, or do you have just all sorts of, interactions with different fishermen?
Yeah, it's a very good and fair question. A bunch of us, I always talk as we, so I always say we because I feel like I never do anything alone, so I'll always say we. There's a group of us that just finished a human dimension study on seals and sharks on Cape Cod and the perceptions among voters, tourists, and commercial fishermen. And one of the things that comes out of that is that commercial fishermen as a group are very disparate. Like, they have very different attitudes, from we understand ecosystem value to can we just get rid of them? They're really annoying. So there's this really wide breadth of outward understanding as well as internal experience. And a lot of that comes with age, experience, attitudes. So it can be challenging, but also one of the most amazing and rewarding conversations in my day is just having a conversation. And the more you can open up to have a conversation rather than not, the more joy it brings.
But they have to be willing to have that conversation.
Exactly.
And open to other ideas. But I'm just thinking about if you were to draw a sort of like a picture for us in the New England coastline, let's say, there's Nantucket Island, there's Nova Scotia up, right? So if we were to think about where these seals are mostly, because they have to come to shore. So when you go to deeper ocean, that's not their habitat. So just tell us a little bit about where all these issues are and where there may be more natural or less human impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that idea of laying out the story about these animals. So we are still learning and understanding what they're doing. And that's part of the fun of it, I think. So
Right.
harboring gray seals, as well as a few other Arctic species, make their home in what we call the entirety of the Northwest Atlantic. So oftentimes where I live on Cape Cod, we think of them as Cape Cod seals, or if you're in California, they're San Francisco animals. But they
Right.
occupy the entire Northwest Atlantic. And seals can actually go out to sea hundreds of miles. They actually do use
Oh,
the shelf. Yeah, and we're learning that because of the really amazing tagging data, satellite tagging data that's being used. And it's only in the last maybe 10 years that we've been able to put these tags on adult gray seals here in the US and see where they go. So we can tag these animals that maybe came out of a rehab situation. Maybe they're just getting better. But a few years ago, we were able to tag adult gray seals and see how far they went. And it's incredible the ocean use area that
wow.
they use. And now with impacts in our ocean and use area. So in our coast, there's an increased desire to put wind energy throughout our oceans offshore. And there's a question about how these things will all kind of mix together, as well as fishery interactions or sand mining. And all of these things together, seals are right in. And the reason is because they also have this coastal component and we see them. And that's what makes them so different from all other marine mammals like whales and dolphins, is we can see what that impact on them, our impact actually is, because we can see them on shore. For better or for
Mm-hmm.
worse, for the seal, we
Right.
see them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's why it's easy to blame them.
Right. That's exactly it. That's exactly the reason. I always joke that um, people love whales and dolphins, even though they eat more fish, but you don't see it. So I always,
Right.
Right.
I'm like, there's 100,000 dolphins, but nobody cares. There's 50 seals, and people are like, it's the end of the world.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what are some of the efforts that you've been working on? Tell us about that with the community efforts.
Mm-hmm.
How can we solve this problem?
Absolutely. So the greatest piece of learning I've ever obtained, I say, isn't any of my degrees. It was lessons from fishermen, and it was to
Mhm.
just listen, don't talk, just listen. Greatest piece of advice ever. And that's really opened up a world of community, a world of understanding that I don't think I would have had otherwise. So from the beginning of, as I was saying in my background, of understanding why do animals get sick, why do they die, what are the impacts, really understanding that that number one reason are fishery interactions or entanglement. It started down a road of, well, what do we do about it, but how do we understand exactly what's happening without laying blame, but truly
Mhm.
understanding what the problem is. So I've been doing research on what we call depredation and bycatch. So depredation is when the animals just eat fish out of nets, don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily get caught, but they eat the catch. And
Mhm.
bycatch, which is obviously when the animals become entangled, oftentimes die
Right.
or live with these entanglements. And working on fishing vessels, our collaborators have put camera systems on nets to actually see what's happening. And all of this work is led by the fishermen we work with. So the questions that they ask, we translate into the scientific method to figure out how do we answer this
Mm.
as a hypothesis.
Mm.
So we can get qualitative and quantitative data both to understand what they're interested in. So we've used not just camera systems, but incorporated doing genomics. We've looked at bycatch in terms of what do these animals eat, and looked at hard parts in the stomachs of the ones that died, as well as the catch on the deck. So we've used stable isotopes. We've used multi methods to try and understand and get to what are these animals eating, how much, and how do they get caught. So we're just throwing everything we can as scientists to help fishermen understand and answer their questions. So that, I think, is one of the most, I think, treasured works of my life, is just being able to do that. And that's built up this idea of doing community science. And what that means is really just letting people come together in a room. And I find that to be the other part of this story that's so important.
Mm-hmm.
We can't do any of this work if we don't come together. And that includes the managers, the fishermen, the marine mammal people, the amazing engineers that create these camera systems, and just put everybody in a room. So over the last couple of years, I feel like that's where my energy and efforts have been, is trying to understand who knows what and get them together to do this, right? To talk together, to share their stories and expertise. So a lot more of the work I'm doing is really just hosting workshops and convenings to make sure the right people are in the room.
Okay.
Wonderful.
But this work you mentioned, this started when you were at Woods Hole, right?
Correct. So this work started when I was at Woods Hole, and it's part of the beauty, I think, of being at the oceanographic is, I have friends that are fisheries managers, engineers, amazing acousticians, oceanographers. And if you all come together and talk, you realize, wow, the power of what we can do to help other people is so extraordinary, just with that interest or that passion that you have.
Right.
And just say, like, perhaps if someone's listening to this that would be interested in looking that up or becoming a part of it somewhere on the East Coast, how would they be able to find those types of workshops through you?
Oh, great question. So one of the other endeavors that is very important to me of trying to get people to talk together is putting together this group. It's called the Northwest Atlantic Seal Research Consortium, lovingly called NASCAR, not NASCAR, as we tell people. And that's
Right.
at sealconsortium.org. And there's a
Okay.
list on there of frequently asked questions, some of the work we're doing, links to different organizations and partners. And you can really see the diversity of types of work because
Cool.
everybody does have the thing that, gets their spark going. And there's
Right.
so many interdisciplinary aspects to it that you can see how maybe you plug into that. And there's also just amazing work happening in terms of not just the scientific research side, but the community aspect. So take a look at the organizations that are partnering together, kind of take a deep dive because it may be more of doing outreach, and you're really good at social media. That's so beneficial to people. And
Right.
where those strengths are with these organizations as well, or weaknesses that you can help fill in the gaps for.
Wonderful. Yeah. I'll definitely try to link that as well if people are interested.
Yeah.
And are these recorded so people can go back and listen to recorded uh,
Good question
talks?
too. So some of them are and some of them are not. So one of the premises of doing community science is trust building. And part of the challenge, especially through this time of virtualness, are recordings, which actually people sometimes don't want because it makes people afraid to speak.
Mm,
So a lot
right.
of the meetings that we have are actually with intention, not recorded, but there are reports. So the reports are available. And there's a lot of different talks that I have given on what we talk about. And that could be a link to some of the work that has happened for community science building.
Well, that's really amazing. So I want to change gears just a little bit, and I think it's not that much change. Just thinking about ocean and also land, we face somewhat similar problems.
Mhm.
It's about ownership or feeling that I own this. This is mine, and I can harvest something from here. And it happens both in land and in ocean.
Yes.
um, and which is there's nothing wrong with that because our economies depend on those things. But I think a lot of those things are translated into consumerism, and
Mm.
consumers are the driving force for it.
Mhm.
So I know you and I have discussed this before. How can we empower the consumers or inform the consumers in such a way that we cause a change directly, because consumer information, consumer action then drives a change.
Absolutely. And that's such an important thing to mention too, is in all the work I do, and I talk about fishermen and fisheries, this isn't a conflict in the sense of being opposed to sustainably using our resources. That's something that is so essential and so important, is how do we sustainably make use of the limited resources we do have? And I think there's so many ways that individuals can. Some of them are very innovative and just thinking about where does your food come from? Very,
Right.
in that innovative way, like, well, let's just take a deeper dive into thinking about where, especially for seafood or our ocean
Hmm.
use, getting oneself knowledgeable about the seafood distribution system and how completely chaotic it actually is. That most of
Right.
the seafood that's produced is exported and not present. So there are
Right.
places where you may have a choice or may not, and advocate for choice, advocate for having something. If you're not local on a coast, at least US based seafood is a good alternative to actually ask for as a consumer. And you have that power as a consumer to demand that. And that's something I've learned in many ways over the years working with fishermen, especially those that are trying to produce food and also keep it local to feed people. You have the voice. All of us have that power to reach out to representatives or markets and just ask. You can go to your local supermarket and talk to a manager and say, I'd really like to buy seafood that's from the US or local based. And you have that power.
Is there a price difference? Like I've never even thought about it. Like what, because I don't eat much fish. I'm actually more vegan, but every once in a while I'll do salmon or something. But I've never thought about like, is this imported or, is there a cost difference between that fish? Do you know? Or
There
is it,
can be, but the value itself is just like everything else in the food system. Is it subsidized or not? What's the real cost of food, and what are you willing to pay, and what do you value? So there are a lot of seafood distribution locally. Say from Alaska, salmon's a great example actually, where you can get wild caught, sustainably harvested, trawled salmon during a very limited season, and it could cost you more. But it's actually healthier perhaps for you than raised resource. That the carbon footprint now is like goes like Atlantic salmon that went to China to get processed and now is at your supermarket in California. So what is that value as a consumer and the impact on the environment? So one builds communities and allows for production to happen, and the other is kind of disconnected from that system. So those are that's interesting. A way to put it is, what is the cost and value, and just a dollar amount, or is it community building loss?
I think that's super essential to like express, even because when you talk about consumerism, I think about, my friends and family and how they choose the different, products that they buy. And it's always, have something to do with the price tag. And there isn't as much thought about the other types of value for the products that you're buying. So what you're saying is spot on with what the message needs to be changed when talking about, buying your food or produce or any type of product in that case. The challenge is then just interesting people to do that research themselves, or how do we make it easy enough for them to do it without, being too confused with all the different sources out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. I know that there's for seafood consumption, there's different guidelines, but it's still not enough, right? It's sometimes it's up to us as a consumer to dig deeper.
Yeah.
But this is why Bridget and I have been working on this app Terra Local, which hopefully, when it is if it is used in the way intended, it will provide that information of local, not only land-based but also sea-based food as well. So consumer information and knowledge is very critical. I completely agree, and I know we always make our decisions based on dollars, but there is so much more to be considered. Now, let's think about another aspect which comes up quite a bit, which is fisheries or fish farms. And I know I've heard of different types of these practices. Some are done properly, some are not done properly, and then now we are also expanding such operations even to harvest kelp or other things that we want to grow in the ocean. Tell us more about that.
Sure.
How do you?
And I'll share at least what I know and what I'm able to speak of. But there's such opportunity if it's done right, and absolutely there's it's not one size fits all when it comes to aquaculture. And on our coast, there's fortunately this it's beautiful. We have shellfish aquaculture right off our waters, and it's actually amazing because it brings people to their food directly, I like where they go to the beach. And that connection to their food is really beautiful. So there's lots of oyster farm tours now. There's lots of kelp farm tours now.
Very cool.
People can connect directly to their food source. And then there are this, just like everything else, is it the commercialization, is it the consolidation that we went through with fisheries for these large offshore operations, which I'm not really in support of, because we're losing that connection again. But we do have to feed the world, and what is sustainable should be the first priority, right? And I'm the optimist, like that should be it, is how can we do this sustainably, healthy, and actually include communities in those discussions. So there's that aspect, there's the aquaculture, and then there's finfish, which is more difficult to deal with. And I have to say, I'm biased in that I've been out on the water. I try and work every weekend if I can as a deckhand on the side. I half joke that I'm a fishmonger and a deckhand, and it's more valuable to me sometimes than publishing a scientific paper to truly understand the issue.
Wow.
From that, I see where my fish comes from. I see these communities being broken and built, and how important they are, and those connections to the sea that they have, and that true understanding of the ecosystem that's so important to me. So I will always look to see if we are fishing sustainably, if the management efforts are actually doing that, and make a little bit of a ruckus if it's not, but also support those when they are. So I would say it's good to call it out, but also call it back in.
For when you're looking for signs of this is a non-sustainable practice, what are some of the major things that you would consider it to be non-sustainable?
Good question.
Yeah, I think it's been really helpful to have my background, say, in pathology, disease, and health. So when you start seeing those things get brought up, especially with finfish farms, that's where my bells, start going off, as we know what those implications are to human and animal health if we start distributing antibiotics through our oceans, if we start increasing, sea lice on fish and getting out into wild populations, changes in the health and actual nutritional condition of wild sourced food, then there's a problem. So that's where my first sort of number one interest comes up. The other is lack and loss of community. So if we don't understand where our food comes from and our harvesters, their stories, there's something there too. So we in New England have seen that with this thing that exists here that I learned about over the years, about catch shares, and learning about the permit requirements for fisheries and how that can go awry, and how corruption can take place in a very well-intended effort to reduce the amount of fishing, where we actually saw consolidation of our oceans take place and remove that idea of community and actually hurt industries working at small scale. So that's where that person connection, that human dimension part of the story becomes really important in understanding what is sustainable and what is not as well.
Wow, yeah.
And have you noticed any changes in disease pressures? Because as we see that there's the choices of foods obviously has an impact on pathogens. We've seen that in our recent history. So what do you say about that from the ocean side? Are there any microbes or microbial things that one should be aware of, especially in seafood and fresh seafood?
Yeah, that's where I feel like my other lifetime comes into play, and
Yeah.
where it's so important to have those conversations where it all is connected. And a lot of this, I think, and a lot of people do think as well, with the evidence to support it, that as our waters warm, and where I am in the Gulf of Maine, it's the fastest warming body of water on the planet.
Right.
We're seeing increases in harmful algal blooms. We're seeing increases in things like Vibrio, which are not good for shellfish if you're a shellfish producer or eater. You don't want that. And those are things that we're seeing potentially increase because of human activity. There are other factors that are out there that are more, I wouldn't say from consuming seafood, but from just interacting with the ocean environment itself.
Yeah.
And there's, again, another great collaboration working with fishermen, which I absolutely love, was creating a marine pathogen guideline with the Massachusetts Department of Health and the Fishermen's Partnership, because most physicians don't even know what's in the marine environment. So if you were to get a cut working on a boat, or working with a marine mammal. Most medical doctors don't know what to look for. So we worked
Right.
together to put a guide together that you could
Great.
take to your physician and be like, I have this odd cut. I was interacting with a fish with a spine. What bacteria can you culture from this? So those have
Oh,
been
wow.
important because we're still learning about what's in our waters, and those interactions with working waterfront communities often just get fixed with salt water.
Right. Right.
They don't get fixed.
Right. Well, but also, the technologies are much more advanced now with
Yeah,
16S or some sequencing efforts. You can probably do a microbial profile of different areas, and they're not too expensive these days, but they
yeah.
have to be repeated.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, and that's where the marine mammals come into play. So,
yeah.
in all my work, in all my efforts, they really are truly, I believe with all my heart, the sentinels of what's happening in our ocean. They're the closest thing we have to us in our waters that we can look to for guidance and also examples of what we potentially could be exposed to. I often half joke too, because I actually tried to do this for myself, is ask people, do you know how much mercury you have, but I can tell you how much the seal has, or do you know
Oh, wow.
your exposure to PCBs are? I can find out in a seal, or what the pathogens are that you have. Oftentimes, even we don't know what's in our own guts that's bothering us, but we
Yeah.
can find
Right.
out in a seal.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah,
That is really
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
yeah.
I want
But
to
they mean,
ask. Oh,
yeah,
go
go
for
ahead.
it. No, go for it,
Go ahead.
Rush.
I was
My
just going to
question was
say,
going to change the topic.
oh, okay. But well, we should go there too. Just the last part of this,
Yeah.
I wanted to bring in the impact of agriculture.
Hmm.
All the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all these things that go into the water bodies, and ultimately end up in the ocean. And with climate change, as you were saying, also toxic algae. So there are all these things that are kind of accumulating more and more and more. So where do you see that? How can we change this direction?
Hmm.
That's a tough question.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's a tough one, but I think, it's not one I haven't thought about, I think, on a daily basis. Like I wake up in the morning and be like, what am I going to do today? Right? What can I do? What can we do? And part of part of the answer I'd like to leave with that is, well, one, we can do something. Don't feel like we can't, even if it's small steps. Each step is a step in that battle to be more on the offense than the defense, I guess. And I think later in my career, what I'm learning is the power of getting involved in civics and understanding
Hmm.
how policy is so important in
Mm,
the work that we do.
Yeah.
And again, it's often forgotten as a scientist that you have that power. You also have that responsibility to educate lawmakers and what happens. And the more that you can understand how civic engagement works, the more
Right.
adept, more effective one can be to use that science. So I would say it doesn't do anything if it's sitting, back here on a shelf.
Yeah. Right.
I have to get it to the
Hmm.
policymakers who can actually write off the appropriations or the bill or the law that's going to let climate action take place at a level that might have a bigger impact. And it seems so hard, but it's not. It's you have a voice, and every single
Hmm.
time you use it, you can make change.
And
I
that's
love
also
that.
coming from the consumer side. That's a really
Right.
good answer.
Yeah.
That's kind of like less about the policy, but more about sharing it with more people is the reason we have Terra Science also, because Raj is the science
Yes.
side of things. And I don't have that science background at all, right? But I can help, post and do different social things to help spread that and hopefully just share different, aspects like your work, Andrea, and just influence more people that way. Like that is our goal. And, you can do the same with other people, and just trying to spread that message is doing something as well. And I
Absolutely.
think, maybe we're not the ones to do the policies, but we can influence people who can, and it's like that chain effect, right? So
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Bridget, you had a question.
So, okay, I wanted to ask about the photo you shared with us where you're holding this big fish. I think it's so cool. I'll put it up on the screen, but I'll just share it for you guys right now to see too. But What type of fish is this?
It is a sea raven, and they are
Wow.
so cool. I think they're really amazing. They've got these huge mouths, and they're they so this the story is, so when I'm out fishing, one of the fishermen I adore, work with, and has been such an amazing collaborator and
Mhm.
built this trust between scientists and fishermen, is he gill nets for dogfish and skate, and so those are the target catch. But I'm always curious about what else is there as this bycatch, and
Right.
always thought that, having looked at many dead marine mammals that were caused by, gill net, my thought was, wow, this gear is terrible. It fishes, you get all this bycatch. And turns out what I learned is, if you fish properly and you don't let your net soak, you don't have a lot of bycatch. And so every time something
Mm.
would come up, I'd be like, finally, something not a dogfish or a skate.
Mm.
And a lot of times it would be fish like that, like sea ravens or
Yeah,
mackerel.
I've never even heard of that before, but he
Yeah.
looks so wild.
So it was this very, very humbling experience where I
Mm.
was really afraid. Occasionally, that's why we were studying seal bycatch. You do get a seal every
Mm.
now and then, but for the most part, it wasn't that usual. And there's a lot of selectivity in the gear itself. That's how it's designed. So yeah, every time something odd came up, I'd be like, "What is this thing?"
Yeah, that is wild.
Yeah.
That's such a cool photo too. Thanks for
Yeah,
sharing that one with us.
and it sounds like so much fun. Just that work,
Mm-hmm.
being out there like that, and engaging with all this. It just
Yeah.
sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember when I was younger, they brought our school to like the Channel Islands for a trip, and we got to do the snorkeling, and that was
Mhm.
like one of my first times actually like seeing so much sea life, and it is just like no other, something that I feel like more people should
Yeah.
try if they've never done that before, to go somewhere like some, islands that's off the coast of California, but
Mhm.
to have any experience of that makes you appreciate it more. And some of those people are going to follow that and get involved in it and want to conserve it, just because they realize that those things are out there, and it's a really much wider world than just what you see on land too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I joke about it, but it's not really a joke. Homo sapiens is just one species.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The planet is full of billions of species,
Right.
and we need to go out there and see how they live and appreciate and respect their habitats. And just like we have a right to seek our food, each of those also have the right to seek their food.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's yeah.
And it's so funny that you say that too, because that seems to be, um, in part of that education and what you can bring to people, is seeing that there's, as you're saying, like there's the arts component of how do you bring the world so that we do feel connected, and that we do have this empathy and understanding that it's not just us in the world, it's these other creatures or plants that need to thrive so that we can actually do that same thing and have that enjoyment from it too. That I know we all need to eat and survive and sustain ourselves, but there's ways to also think of it as joy and the wonder of what life actually is. And the more you
Hmm.
see it and are connected to it, the more I think people can see it for themselves and actually take action, understand those connections, think about the
Hmm.
value of where your food came from. But yeah, being able to see that and how you explained it to somebody who hasn't is so important.
Hmm. And I like that you mentioned art as well. You have a degree, I believe, also in like studio art, if I'm not wrong. How do you feel that you bring together that like artistic side of you and the biology side, and bring those two together?
I love that question. So I used to think when I first started, it was the physical process of doing art, like creating a visual understanding. So when I began, I was doing science illustration, and I thought, well, this is it. I'm going to either do science or do science illustration, one of the two. And so I started doing stuff like illustrating field guides, or how does this mussel look in a fish? I did that for a friend for a publication. And then I started really truly understanding its how I do the science and how I communicate it in a more illustrative way. And how does that look or sound to people as well? And I was laughing because one of the conversations I remember having early on with one of my wonderful mentors was just sitting and this conversation of, she said, I'm so linear and you are not. And it's actually a good thing of how we can see the world. And that always stood out to me of, yeah, when I'm drawing, I'm not linear about things. I have a method or a result maybe I want to see, but it's the process itself that
Right.
gets me to the end. It's not a linear path. And that's how I think I've always done my science connections, is how can you get others to see what you see? And that's the artistic part I think I bring in more than the physical, actual, painting or drawing now.
Great. Yeah.
But it's still fun. And I think in a day-to-day with students, it's really fun trying to explain processes or physiology, or being able to draw it out and explain
Yeah.
it. I use that a lot on a constant basis.
Good. Yeah.
And then for my own enjoyment, I think I sit with my journal and write and just see the world for what it is often. So that part I bring to myself.
So great. I love that.
Yeah, I like that. I think especially being able to express how you're thinking, even science or technical aspects in an art form, that can be really powerful uh, to bring the message through. And there are many magazines or journals. I think National Geographic and they've been kind of doing that, bringing videos,
Yeah.
bringing all these experiences out to people.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's fantastic. We need more of that.
Yeah. Science
So
communication. I think that's the way back in the day when I was doing it. It to me was a very visual type of communication. And I feel like, there's no limit now to what that means, whether it's journalism, writing, art form, video, sound, podcast, right? It's understanding how to translate the world to people in the way they can understand.
Yeah. Well said.
well, great. Yeah, that's great. Well, this has been an amazing
Yeah.
conversation, and I learned a lot about seals and the relationships. And so thank you so much, Andrea. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Andrea. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really appreciate it, letting me get excited about things I'm passionate about in this very interdisciplinary world of mine.
It's absolutely been a pleasure. And I think this will be a really interesting, topic for people to hear about as well. We try to bring all sorts of topics. And I think this is one of those that, you can see in that image too. It's just something completely different and really interesting. So thank you for sharing that. And if you guys are listening, please make sure to give this episode a like. Please subscribe, hit the notification bell. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you. You've been watching Terra Science, the podcast where reality matters.
We discuss food, planet, consciousness, the issues that we face, and the solutions that can be offered. And we discuss with wonderful guests who are leading the way in finding these solutions.
Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell.